Welcome, everyone. The short story of what we're talking about today is how, in work where there's a lot of serious need, those who do that work are often put in this situation of responding to urgency without there being a kind of care infrastructure to make sure you balance that out. And so what we know about doing trauma informed work is that has to include the staff too. It's not just what we do to be trauma informed towards those we serve. So that's essentially the topic today. And as I shared, Donielle Prince, I'm an advisor to 10 Collective. And in general, in my work life, I do mental health education that's focused on trauma awareness. Um, and I have been a therapist of children and adults, and I'm interested in a lot of the things that I learned in order to support individuals and families. I also see, and I think I know that many therapists share this view that a lot of those strategies are valuable for the community too. So how do you bring, and so doing trauma informed practice is is a great vehicle for bringing those kind of strategies into community facing, community healing work as well. And um, just a housekeeping, as we do with these 10 webinars. I think everybody knows how to use Zoom, but feel free to change your name and pronouns. Um, and do what you need. Very, don't worry like, if you need to be off camera because it helps. You can listen while you have to take care of other things. Do whatever you need to do. And we we already kind of did our check-in, so I won't repeat that one. But yeah, thank you all for sharing where you're from and your organizations. And this was um, the original agenda. And like I said, I'll go through 2 and 3 very quickly. I'm probably not going to say much about them. And then we'll focus on policy and practice. And I have a couple of questions that'll start our conversation. And I just left this in here. I probably won't say much about it, but just what do I mean by family healers? Because that's not necessarily a term that people use all of the time, although I've certainly heard it before. But I'm kind of thinking about all of the people, agencies, organizations, professional people who do professional services that contribute to family well-being as family healers. And often when families are showing up for services, what can come with that are a lot of needs that sometimes can feel urgent to respond to. Many of you are probably already familiar with the Strengthening Families framework by the Center of the Study for Social Policy, which is an organization that really tries to figure out how do we strengthen families in a way that improves their well-being and is less punitive, and it recognizes that a lot of the concerns that families have to do with their needs not being met. And so the Strengthening Families framework has these 5 components you see on the right side of your screen, which is building parental resilience, taking a look at the social connections in families' lives, which is when I was talking before about the connections between doing therapy on an individual and family basis and a community basis. Social connections is one of the first questions you might ask someone you're working with in counseling, because you know that uh, whatever people are going through, they're going to their outcomes are going to be better if they have social support. So that's a key part of the Strengthening Families framework. And then, of course, concrete support in times of need. So what they actually need. And then, in terms of families, making sure that parents have a knowledge of parenting practice and child development, and also supporting children with their social and emotional competence. It's just, I would say, just it's it's helping children with that, but it's also the parent-child bond is really what that part is about. And I found this slide. Um, I've seen it in social media, but I found this particular uh, slide and wanted to include it because to me, if I had to give this talk just one slide and just talk it through from here, it would be you don't need to set yourself on fire to keep others warm. And that has a lot to do with the sense of urgency and the idea that you can't balance that with meeting the needs of those who do the serving. And so we're going to focus on what that means to operationalize, so the policy and practice part today. And just I'm I'm putting up this slide. I'm just going to make it pop up quickly. Um, I went over this in part one, and I just kind of highlighted here the takeaways from this idea that we don't have to set ourselves on fire and what it means when we do that. So it's the highly vulnerable clients, seeing they're so vulnerable, their needs are so urgent. I can't think of we as an organization can't think of anything else but meeting their needs. And then there's this illusion of zero sum because of that urgency. We can disregard employee well-being or only talk about it but not build the infrastructure that would ensure those employee needs are being met. And so this point about meeting the urgent needs and creating a culture of care in the organization are not mutually exclusive priorities. And as with most things, the issue is structural. You have to build that structure so that till the point it becomes automatic. And a key point of that and related to the work that 10 Collective is focused on is cultivating a caring community so that we're not in the position of urgently responding to needs. In a way, we're going to have to urgently respond to needs at times, but but how do we balance that? How do we acknowledge that in pretty much every policy and practice that is in the organization so that people aren't burnt out and harmed really? And I put this definition of vicarious trauma just to have a working definition of what we're talking about. When we talk about the harm that is done to employees where their needs are not being taken into account, and I'll just read what the American Counseling Association, how they've defined vicarious trauma. It can be considered the emotional residue of exposure developed from working with people and hearing their trauma stories, becoming witnesses to the pain, fear, and terror that trauma survivors have endured. And this quote by Sandra Bloom begins to guide us into the role that the organization has
Progress.
in, the organization has in um, ensuring that employees that we minimize as much as possible the exposure to vicarious trauma, and where we can't minimize it because, for instance, and this is true in most human service work, but just thinking about counseling, you're literally there to hear those stories. So you're going to witness them. But then, so that whenever you're in that situation where the exposure cannot be prevented, how do you balance with care? And so Sandra Bloom created the sanctuary model, an early proponent of organizational trauma-informed practices in the field of psychiatry. What she learned was just talking to people in organizations about becoming trauma informed, kept running into the roadblock. And she articulated it like the quote you see in front of you: trying to implement trauma specific clinical practices without first implementing trauma informed organizational culture change is like throwing seeds on dry land. And I thought that's the perfect metaphor. It's the seeds are fertile and prepared to do what they are meant to do, but there's not a fertile soil for it. So it's a beautiful metaphor, and helps us start to think about what do we need to do to create a fertile soil in our organizations. Um, in thinking about healing vicarious trauma in the workplace, um, in some ways it goes without saying, but the Goli Jansen addresses this work, and this quote is a perfect representation of what the method would be. So when people perceive their organizations to be supportive, they experience lower levels of vicarious trauma. So that statement comes from Jansen's research. It's kind of a conclusion of the analysis, but it's exactly what I was sharing before, that When there's uh, when the exposure to the vicarious trauma cannot be prevented, you increase support. And for those of you, which is sounds like pretty much everyone here, familiar with what it means to be trauma aware, trauma informed, what trauma informed practices are. Whenever we talk about traumatic stress, we're always talking about stressors with or without buffers. So we have worse outcomes when there's no supportive buffer. When we have those supportive buffers, we can actually see changes in the long term outcomes of trauma for individuals. And of course, it's going to be the same at the organizational level for the employees. And so, just in terms of what a healthy organizational culture is, I'm not going to go in depth on this because I did spend time on it in part one, but I just wanted to put it in front of our eyes. Tend has the 8 realms of employee wellness, and Allison spent uh, did a series. So each one of these spokes of the wheel, there's a separate webinar that you can watch in the series and just kind of learn more about what employee wellness looks like in terms of, as you can see around the wheel, um, defining defining roles, um, what productivity means, the importance of collaboration, um, autonomy and leadership style, um, the centering mental health, uh, general practices around communication and conflict, accountability, and ensuring a baseline, a foundation of psychological safety. Um, and And then I just also wanted to point out, I mentioned Sandra Bloom has the sanctuary model, like thinking how do you set this up structurally. And then the importance of, I'm going to spend some time on the next few. I have a slide that addresses just kind of the core principles of creating a healthy organizational culture whenever you're dealing with humans, whether it's just, as individuals or as part of an organization, there are 5 key principles um, that psychologists are people who do clinical practice, because I'm getting tripped up on. There's so many different. There's psychiatrists, psychologists, counselors, all these different titles, but there are principles of counseling practice that are rooted in ensuring that a person has a sense of empowerment, choice, collaboration, safety, and trustworthiness in their environment. And when those things are true, you will find people feel more supported and they're more resilient, essentially. And so we'll go here. This one, I noticed there's things in the chat, so I'm going to pop it open really quick. Okay. Oh, residue. Yeah. Sandra related to that word. Um, let's see. Okay, I guess I saw most of this. And a couple of other people have joined, so welcome. Okay. All right. And so, and I'm not going to go over this. I kind of spent a lot of time on this in part one, but just do want to make sure to include that safety and connection require a culturally responsive and attuned environment. And there was a previous Tend webinar that I did called Sociocultural Trauma in the Workplace that kind of went over each of these bullet points in more depth. So I know I'm going to move too fast for you to really take this in, but the title is the main point that relates to our conversation today. So how does an organization um, create that kind of environment where people feel that kind of safety, that psychological safety that's part of the 8 realms of employee wellness? That's part of what we're going to talk about today. And a reminder that trauma informed is not just for the clients. And so you've heard me say that a few times already. Often when trauma informed practices are considered and even in the uptake, even though I think most models address the fact that employee well-being is important, a lot of the work, the emphasis of the work of trauma-informed practice gets focused on how the employees do work for clients and forget what it means to create a infrastructure, a reliable, consistent infrastructure that cares for the employees. And the cost is clear in the burnout. And in part one, I talk a bit about how do people burn out while they're still working, so that how does that impact how they're serving the clients, because their needs, the employees' needs, aren't being met. Um, so uh, to in this first quote is kind of a way of understanding how all of these things are linked. So, to be trauma informed is to understand the role that violence and victimization play in our society, and to use that understanding to design service systems and everyday practices that accommodate the vulnerabilities of trauma survivors. And I noted to add caregivers, the service providers, and family community, and the service sectors altogether. That's just as relevant. And just as when we're accommodating trauma survivors, it's true also that people who are at risk of vicarious traumatization require interactions, so the relational element, and environments that reduce the sense of threat, that's the psychological safety piece, and increase sense of support and emotional safety. And so what would that look like? And this is where I'm going to go over those 5 principles and kind of thinking them through. These 5 principles, I think, originally were really developed to think about the counseling process, so people as individuals, but of course, counselors also deal with families, so there's already a systems element to them, and I think they also apply in workplaces. So empowerment, caring well for your employees through the principle of empowerment means that you're strengths focused, so that people feel empowered in the development of their work, um, and their also how they take care of themselves, and also how the organization comes together and to create collective care. Choice is particularly important when facing traumatic stress, whether that is the direct trauma or vicarious trauma. And the reason for that, from a clinical perspective, is that choice reduces anxiety. So it's important in workplaces to integrate structure and protocols, and especially in this family healing work that we're talking about. There is a lot of urgency and crisis, and there are protocols that are necessary. Um, However, that doesn't mean there isn't space for autonomy with support in the decision making and that alone will increase the risk of that vicarious traumatization, because people feel like they have choice, and there's trust, which will also is its own bullet point, its own principle. Um, Collaboration, of course, maximizing authentic collaboration between staff and leaders. And I put the word authentic in there, and I want to emphasize it because there's often, um, where it's understood that collaboration is important, it will look like that's in the structure, but the only way collaboration is authentic is if the ideas of everyone involved, so in this case, staff, if those ideas materialize. Of course, it's not going to be every idea, but if there isn't a true uptake, then the collaboration, it's not real. And without it being, if it's not authentic, then it is not contributing to well-being. It's not having the impact that these 5 principles we're talking about can have on reducing traumatic stress or the effects of that vicarious trauma. So it's really important that organizations find it's really a culture change, because gather information from staff and use it, treat staff as though they have expertise, because they do in the work that they're doing. In terms of safety, the principle of safety, um, this can mean a lot of things. Here, I'm focusing on in the workplace. Um, you know, the fundamental nature of work. You show up, you have responsibilities, and there's needs to be some type of feedback loop so that you know that you're meeting those responsibilities in a way that serves the needs of the organization. So these are it's fundamental. You're going to get assigned work. You're going to get feedback. In too many workplaces, this can feel very punitive, very disciplinary, very almost robotic at times. And the uh, what makes people feel safe is that they have a relationship. They have a sense of connection. They feel cared about. So it's important that the way that we do kind of the basics of showing up at work, which can feel a little different than how we show up for family or our friends or our community, we still need to bring those elements of relationship building and opportunities for connection. And even we talked about this a little bit in our discussion last time. Um, the importance of being, I called it solo grounding, but what I mean by that is sometimes you need time to yourself just to reset. Um, uh, just to be able to, maybe process something that was difficult or just, you know, recover yourself from the pace of what's going on. And so, in building relationships and even having this kind of time to ground yourself in the workday and across the arc of a month of work or a week of work, a month of work, a year of work, um, that has to be built in. You have to make time. I feel like most people are probably familiar with as we started to learn more about checking in during meetings. Um, if it could feel to people like it was quote unquote a waste of time, or you had to add time to a meeting so there was time for effective checking in. But it's not, it's if you understand this principle of safety, you recognize that it is essential to the work to take that time to really connect again on an authentic level. So finding ways to meaningfully connect beyond just, check-ins are wonderful and should be a part of the process, but really getting creative about how you connect and make sure there's real relationship happening. Um, in the organization. This is where you have the more that you have that relational element, the more safety people feel. And then the last core principle is trustworthiness. And we just taking the time to point out that when we're exposed to traumatic stress, as we often are in urgent work environments, um, one of the things that can be difficult is remembering. And so, um, and this goes back to the core. One of the core functions of work is you're showing up to do work that meets the needs of the organization. We know that. However, the more urgent your work is, the more there's elements of crisis. You're meeting the urgent needs of real humans. Um, the more that that is the case, one of the symptoms of trauma is having it affects your memory. So that means in order to create an environment where people can be successful, you have to address that issue. You have to find ways to support the fact. You have to actually treat people like they are experiencing these stressors. And so creating clear expectations about activities and timelines with reminders and patient structured repetition is important. Um, so we don't end up in that, that punish kind of feedback model. If you recognize that repetition is just a part of support, then you are going to create more trust in the organization, particularly between um, leadership who assigns work and the staff who do the work. And so we also want to make sure that we center. that the fact that healthy organizational culture has to center equity and culturally responsive practices. Um, and so this is of course, a longer conversation, and I went through more of these points in the sociocultural trauma in the workplace. But just we can't. We, the core principles don't necessarily address that. Although, if you're doing real and authentic relationship and collaboration, you're going to get there. But we just have to take into account the society that we live in, and so we have to be very intentional about equity-centered practices, including in the dynamics, including how that affects relationship building. I mean, that takes some real work and honesty to get there. Um, Never skipping the step of acknowledgement, that making sure that we actually articulate that equity and culturally responsive practices are important. And with that acknowledgement, we can create real rather than symbolic standards for equity practice. And that means both among employees and, of course, in the work that you do with clients. And okay. And so, with all of that, we arrive at policy and practice. And so, I'm going to take a couple of moments. Let me just see the time. Okay. Um, my goal is 8 minutes so that we have like 20 minutes to. I want to hear from you and I have a couple of questions for you. But in these next 8 minutes, I'm just going to talk a little bit about what does it mean to to create that. I think of it as creating a care infrastructure, just like whatever the work is you're doing, you create an infrastructure for it so that it can become automatic. We know how we do the things that we do. Um, and so if we want to move from setting employees on fire and this having them get used to that often because they love the work, they care about people, and so they keep showing up until they can't anymore. Rather than have that happen, how do we build a care infrastructure so through policy and practice so that people don't get to that point in the first place? So thinking through creating caring community at work in terms of policy is just a reminder of a statement that I think we've all heard many times. Budgets are statements of our values. So one of the things is creating staffing levels that support recovery from intense work. Um, Again, like drawing from the counseling principles, the individual and family level, and then putting that into the workplace. Um, we can't always avoid, and this is part of what resilience means. We can't always avoid the fact that there is challenge, crisis, tragedy. But we can't have a situation where we move as though those things didn't happen and we just keep going. That is going to definitely create your high turnover anyway. So it makes more sense to create, usually the key point is staffing levels. People are overloaded because there's not enough people. So you have to be available. Um, Even if you try to observe people not working outside of work hours, often if you're talking about human beings, people will feel because there's not enough coverage, people will feel the need to respond to the needs of clients, um, even when they are off or even when they need time off because they worry about what's going to happen to them. And so it's just really important to think about um, how to make sure people have abundant abundant PTO and take care around how shifts are scheduled. Try to address caseload acuity and try to advocate for, because this is not, especially well, in many environments, it's not so easy to have the staff that is not to create the budget that gives you the staff that you actually need. But thinking through what that means about the scope of the work that you do too. Not taking on more than people can do and thinking about the recovery time as part of that's a care infrastructure. The time that people need to recover from the intensity is part of the schedule, is part of the timeline, is part of how we assign work. I called that minding to employees' time. Prioritizing and training empathetic leadership is very important. Um, I don't even know how to emphasize that a lot enough. And I know in some of the tend work, we address this issue of empathetic leadership and how it's often lacking because the people who get promoted to leaders, it's often because of their ability to um, produce and to be task oriented. And I don't want to globalize this comment too much because nothing is that linear, but sometimes people who are more productive and task oriented have not necessarily developed other skills as well. It doesn't mean they cannot, because we can all be balanced. Some of us who are high empathy and maybe we don't get things done on time because we're too busy being empathetic can also increase our task efficiency and our task productivity. So the so it's not about saying, trying to make global statements about who's good at what or not. It's more emphasizing that empathetic training and empathy is really central and important. It should be a non-negotiable when you're thinking about who should be leaders. Um, and then policies that increase safety. And that, of course, should include equity-centered and culturally responsive opportunities. I feel like there's a lot of information that people are probably, especially if you're on LinkedIn, I see a lot of blogs on this topic. But realizing that part of safety, especially for marginalized groups, includes includes being uh, uh, people being able to bring their whole selves to work, and sometimes people from marginalized backgrounds don't feel that way, and they're never going to feel safe if they have to hold back who they are or be able to contribute at the level of their talent. So it's important that there are policies that reflect this in there are policies that reflect this in your workplace. And then thinking more about creating caring community at work through practices. Um, it's important both to make PTO is a great way to help people with self-care, but we also have to think about collective care and carving out time to as a team for employees to create that planning, share their plans. Um, this increases this increases the sense that the organization actually values it if you're sitting around talking about it as part of your work time, as part of your staff meeting. And it also it helps create a norm that this is actually important, and this helps push against the idea that productivity is the only important thing. um, and also know the signs, practices that help. That a lot of these are about having relationship because then you are more aware of what people are experiencing. But and in this point also is knowing that some people are going to be more affected by these settings where there's a lot of trauma that's being witnessed, the vicarious trauma, and that's going to be linked to, it can sometimes trigger their own trauma. And so, um, being really familiar with the signs, so you know when your coworkers and your staff might be having a harder time, coping with things at work. Sometimes things at home can be impacting that, but sometimes things at work are affecting the ability to stay calm in crisis, to remember their protocols, to be able to complete their tasks. So organizations can help their staff prepare for those moments, being aware of the signs in themselves, and also to offer support. And then having and thinking again about equity, finding that those spaces and the support that you need to have those courageous conversations and taking action around equity so that you have real rather than symbolic equity in your workplace. And then thinking in terms of both policy and practice, it is supporting staff in creating and strengthening their internal resources. And I put this last on purpose because often it is first and centered, because it's not just about people doing their own work to be more resilient. if you're taking on employees in high intensity, um, a very high intensity workplace, it's not just on them to figure out how to be resilient. So that's part of it. We do want to increase people's resilience. And again, connecting this to how counselors work, you absolutely want people to feel more empowered internally that they can ground themselves and take care of themselves. But I think too often we default to thinking people should just do that on their own and it's no one else's responsibility. And that's just not true. Creating resilience doesn't negate the fact that we need to have supportive environments. But given that, what are ways that we can build resilience for employees? So, respecting boundaries and also helping people respect and draw their own boundaries. So, because sometimes it's your staff, you're creating the space, but they're not taking it. And that can often have to do with them not having that sense of psychological safety. They might feel like they might lose their job, even though you're saying they can take off. They might lose their job or lose your respect or lose something, and not be able to set their own boundaries. So sometimes you need to support them in maintaining that work-life balance, um, and reinforce them not being available during downtime. So if they're working during their lunch, it's like don't work during your lunch. Um, Creating space for mental and physical well-being, and this is if you have spent a lot of time uh, learning about trauma-informed practice, the space actually matters too. um, and access to peaceful spaces and nutritious food. um, mm, uh, and if you can do it, if you have that kind of design, places where people can walk and be in nature, can be very grounding. And then find ways, again, this is back to the social connections. How do you encourage positive peer connection, opportunities for mentorship, partnership, fun, opportunities to socialize so that those relationships can be built? Because one of those core principles is about relationship. And then ensuring that staff have outlets to support. And be sure to check out 10 Collective. Allison led a great um, webinar on Beyond EAP, and there's a lot of concrete practices in that webinar as well. Um, and so this can be part of a benefits plan, access to counseling, and also just opportunities for employees to just talk about what's going on with them, an event kind of way, because there's that fine line between when they really do need to have some counseling support versus they just need to be able to process and get off their chests like some things that are challenging about the work itself. And with that, okay, good. So I'm gonna go off the slides. I'm not gonna come back to the slides, so I'll just show you really quick. Um, be sure to connect with 10 because this is a lot of what I've talked about is the kind of work that 10 can support. But now that I'm we have a good 15 minutes because I have two questions for you and plus anything that you have to share. So let me stop this. I can see faces. Um, so I'm gonna look in, feel free to come off mute and share a thought, ask a question. I'm gonna look at the chat and then I have some questions for everyone. So I see, okay, some comments. Oh, Allison, we reward sociopathic behavior in many professional settings. Yeah, I don't know if you've talked about that in a specific webinar, but I know that you've been sharing that on the 10 page, some research even on that topic. And thank you also, Allison, for the links to the other webinars I mentioned. So I went over relatively quickly to keep us within the hour, but I went over some ideas about policy focuses, ways of engaging practices, ways of helping employees um, build their resilience. And I know probably the first thought is how realistic is this in your environment? So I'm just kind of curious if you had any thoughts about that. And it can be in any way, but also particularly one of two ways. What are you already doing where you feel like you are doing that and what kind of outcomes are you seeing from it? And if you don't have anything to share where you can say, we're really already doing these things, or at least a few of these things, um, what would you like to see your organization do next to get closer, even if it's just one step? So I will kind of ask these questions in the chat a little and give you, and while I do that, it gives you a little time to think about it. But I am really curious what you're already doing that supports your employees. And of course, share a little bit about what you do. Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
And hopefully, we will work with you all again.